Hey yo, artists and musicians.
Who, us?
Yeah, do you want your own vinyl records?
Yeah, but I can't order 1,000 of them. Or wait like a year to get them. Yeah, we're going on tour in 2 months.
Check out our friends lathecuts.com. They'll make you vinyl singles in quantities as small as 50 copies and as quickly as 3 or 4 weeks.
Get out of here.
You heard me right. All their pricing is a la carte, and they can help you pick a package that fits your budget.
Okay, who we talk to about this?
You need to email my buddy Mike. His address is lathecuts@yahoo.com. And if you mention low profile, you'll get a 10% overrun on your order.
So if I order 50 records,
Mike's gonna send you 55.
if I order 75, I guess you would get 82 and a half.
Something like that. Remember, you gotta mention low profile to get that deal, and it won't be around forever.
What was the address again?
That's lathecuts@yahoo.com. Custom-made records in small quantities. Mention low profile to get a 10% overrun on your order.
And emailing now.
The illustrations for Season 4 episodes were drawn by Taylor W. Rushing. To find out more about his work and see more of his art, as well as limited edition prints and merchandise, you can visit taylorwrushing.com or find him on Instagram at twrushing. Hey everybody, this is Mark Lee, and you're listening to Low Profile with Mark Lee Morrison. The first thing I want to do on this episode is introduce you to Jack Habiger. So I'm just going to call him up right now. Hey, Jack?
Hey, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you just fine. While you're on the line, I'd like to say how we met because it does tie into this episode.
Ties in perfectly.
Yeah. So I went downtown to Lavoyer here in Olympia to go catch Jeffrey Lewis's band playing. Opening for Jeffrey was a band called Pigtails. That was you up there with your buddies.
Yes.
And
yeah.
you guys were opening. I loved it. And then we got to talking afterwards and found out that we had some things in common. We're both from California, living in Olympia. We both dabbled in music journalism as well as writing and recording music.
Mm-hmm. Both fans of the band Lake.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
I think they're really going to go somewhere.
Yeah, I don't think I can get that band on the show, honestly.
No, not at this point. Yeah, if you get some money.
Right, probably have to bribe them.
That is a good time to plug the Patreon. If you want to get Lake on the show, go over to Patreon, pick that highest tier, and sometime soon you'll get a nice fund together to get those people on. Sure, and maybe once that happens, maybe at that point you can get Pigtails on too. But we'll see. I can't make any promises.
Yeah, I heard those people in that band are, they're hard to persuade.
They're hard to get a hold of, and once you are, they are snooty.
Ooh.
Hard to talk to.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hard to talk to, how was it talking to Jeffrey Lewis? You're hosting this episode, and
I am, yes. Thank you for having me. Thanks for asking me to do a guest spot. I had a lot of fun talking to Jeff, and we had such a great time playing together. It felt like, I jumped at the chance to interview him for your show. Felt like a good full circle moment, which I think I maybe mentioned in the interview. And Jeff was great to talk to. We talked while he was working on some drawings in his sketchbook.
Right.
So,
this would be a good a good point to mention that he's also a comic book artist. He
Right,
draws
yeah.
largely autobiographical comics.
Right, yeah. He's got a series called Fuff that is, I think they're coming up on a name change here for this next issue, but historically
heard
known as
that.
Fuff. But he was working on some drawings while we were talking over Zoom, and we had a lovely conversation about, music and comics and the Holy Modal Rounders and Julie Kupferberg, all kinds of great people. And it was really great to catch up with him.
Yeah, he had some really poignant things to say about David Berman too, which is really
Yes.
cool. Big Silver Jews fan. And you got sort of the skinny on his so-called films. And for the uninitiated, I don't mean that in a denigrating way. It's cool to get the inside scoop on that.
Yeah, I was very happy to talk to him about that kind of stuff. And
He's a
it's-
history enthusiast.
Oh yeah, and we
Big
definitely
time.
get into that stuff, and that's some of my favorite parts of the interview because historically in interviews, you always want to get someone excited talking about what they love, and I felt like once we got into that we were really cooking with gas because he was very enthusiastic, very happy to talk about that kind of thing, and that's when the interview is going real good when you get someone going.
Man, you did such a great job. Thank you so much. This is your first time guest hosting. I hope it's not the last.
Well, first time guest hosting, but second appearance on the show.
Right, you were co-hosting.
Yeah, we did Lavender Country. I have a brief appearance in that, and hopefully, I'd love to come back and do more. This is, whenever anyone asks me about podcasts, I say I don't know anything about podcasts, but I listen to one, and it's this one. So I feel very lucky to be a part of it.
Oh, shucks.
I don't know how it started, I suppose it was about the 10th grade. I'd never bought much music, I just listened to whatever was played. But there was classic rock there on the radio, and it was blowing my mind. And it was all the records no one wanted now, so they were easy to find. So I started getting LPs, they only cost a little, and these LPs were all the ones I needed from the 60s, with psychedelic art on all the great sleeves, much cooler and much cheaper than the CDs, and that's the way I caught the disease. I caught the disease for LPs. There wasn't any internet, a lot of times you just took a shot. Pretty soon you figured out which records would be awesome or not. If the year was from the 60s, it was probably good bang for your buck. If the year was from the 80s, it was guaranteed to totally suck. I started learning about the LPs. At that time, education just cost low fees. $3 for this Dylan record, oh yes please. And the Cream and Rolling Stones and Arlo Guthries. A giant treasure trove with all for pennies. And that's the way I caught the disease. I caught the disease for LPs.
You got your start in New York playing open mics and recording homemade tapes, and your newest release is these 2020 tapes, which is a return to the style of those early tapes. Can you walk me through the recording and songwriting process for that? Is it different than normal or a return to form to those beginnings?
Well, I sort of had always just been making recordings via whatever recording device I happened to have on hand, whether that was like a Walkman at certain times in early years, and then at some point I got like a little digital recording device, and I've just had various devices, and then some stuff recorded into the phone. I just feel like when I write a song and I want to get a document of it before I forget it, and just to have a little recording of it, I always just use whatever is the easiest documentation device that I have around at that time, going back to when I first started doing this in the late 90s. So I just have tons of these kinds of recordings. Some songs end up migrating from the little pile of home recorded songs into stuff that I might be doing live at an open mic or trying out at gigs or showing to my band if it's something that I think might be good with some extra instrumentation. And then other songs just never kind of graduate through that filter, and they just are something that I wrote and then I recorded it, and I never did anything with it beyond that, just because, I don't know, maybe I just didn't feel like it was worth playing for people or for whatever reason. So I always have a bunch of these recordings, and then there was something, just being locked in my apartment for months during the early months when things were really particularly bad in New York City. I was writing a lot of songs, and I just was kind of, I was pleased listening to these recordings. And a friend of mine, David Tattersall from the band The Wave Pictures in England, he was releasing some of his home recordings online. And I was like, why not? Some of these are like very rough around the edges, or some of them are, very personal, or some of them are not things that I would play in front of people necessarily. But it just made sense to me. I felt like they were pleasing to me as a collection of just what, so I made a collection of songs from last year, 2019, and songs from this year, 2020. And also it sort of made sense to me, the two different realities represented, stuff that was affecting my emotions in 2019 versus stuff that was going on in 2020. It just, I just liked the idea of those two collections back to back, though I was a bit frightened to put it in public and have it available digitally, because it has been a long time since I kind of let my little home recordings out into the world. And nowadays there's more people listening to my stuff than there were in the early 90s. So it's kind of like, I don't know if this meets people's expectations for what they would be expecting to hear from me, which is part of why I didn't make it available on streaming. I only put it on my own site because I don't want it really released into the streaming
Right.
ecosystem.
Right. Speaking of those early tapes, your tapes from the Crypt 97 to 01.
Yeah, that was a fun one to make. There's a reason I didn't put those recordings out earlier. It's kind of like a glimpse into the archives of me as a, in my early and mid 20s, just making up those songs. And, now that I'm in my 40s, I'm like, it feels like stuff that, I wouldn't want people to get their first impression of me from that stuff. Like, I don't think it's my best work. It's just kind of like a look into the archives.
Right. Well, I was wondering if we could maybe play a brief clip of songs about songwriting.
Sure, that was one of my earliest. I mean, that's probably from 1998 or something like that.
Songs about songwriting suck, so I'm writing a song about songs about songwriting. Songs about songwriting suck, so I'm writing a song about songs about songwriting. A guy that I saw play once at this open mic said, "Here's a song I wrote that I don't like." He sang about how there was...
We have not yet talked about your comics work, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how your comics work and your music projects blend together with stuff like your CD packaging and stuff like these original tapes.
Well, I graduated college in 97, and my whole goal was just to somehow figure out how I could survive from my comic books. I'd always been making comic books, and it was always kind of my dream to make comic books professionally, whether that was to work for a company or just make my own comics and publish them. And I entered the regular working world, and I was basically existing as a stereotypical starving artist with almost zero money and no food in the house regularly, but I was just working on my comics all the time. And I started also making up songs during that period, like my first real winter out of school. And it was just, an extremely lonely time, an extremely broke time. And I working on comics in addition to these teaching gigs and like handing out surveys at movie theaters and various other things I was doing to just to make grocery money and rent money and laundry money. And making up songs just kind of entered the picture in addition to making comics. And while I was accumulating rejection letters from different comic companies, and once in a while getting a little illustration job for $20 from a local magazine, or submitting my stuff to other magazines, the songs were like just a kind of solace and a way to also spend all of that lonely, broke time. The songs kind of just became a way of procrastinating on making the comics. I'd have a comic book on my desk that I needed to work on, and I was like, but there was a guitar in the house, so sometimes instead of sitting down and working more on the comic into a cold winter's night, I would just pick up the guitar and make up something on the guitar. And then hanging out at the open, when I discovered the open mic at Sidewalk on East 6th Street in Manhattan, and I realized that there was this open mic on Monday nights, that kind of also gave me a reason to, a place where I could present my songs and sell my comic books. So it was always like a little way, the music and the open mic was a nice way for me to have a chance to sell some of my stuff. And after a number of months being a very hardcore regular at the open mic night, just being there every Monday night from the beginning of the night to the end of the night, I started meeting other people, even though I was usually very kind of like isolated and shy and just sitting by myself with my sketchbook. But over time, over like a year or 2 years, I knew all these other musicians. So, people were asking me to play gigs with them, and somebody would say, hey, I'm playing, in October, I have a gig at Nightingale's. Would you want to play that gig with me? And, things just grew from there. So meanwhile, I was always hoping that my comic career was going to somehow be my main source of making a living. But while I was like waiting for that to happen, which never did happen, I was, within a few years, by 2002, I was like, I'm actually making a living just from like gigging and touring and music stuff. So at that point, I stopped having other day jobs and just concentrated on booking gigs and touring. But I never stopped making comics, and I was always selling my comics at my gigs and doing artwork for all, every time I would release an album, of course, I would do the artwork for it. It wouldn't even cross my mind to have somebody else do the artwork for it.
And you've got the end of your series Fuff has ended with issue 12, and I hear that there's a new series title coming soon. Is that what you're working on right now?
Yeah, well, right now I'm just inking some sketchbook sketches because it doesn't really require my brain to be focused on it in the same way. So I can like talk and ink these sketches at the same time. I'll probably have maybe a 24-page issue or 28-page issue to be issue number 1 of the new series, which will basically just be more of the same as the old series, but with a different title and with a new number 1. And also, I think over the course of the Fuff series, which I started in 2004, I think I really learned a lot about making comics. I feel like I'm at a better level of development now. So I kind of like the idea of having a series that starts with me being able to make comics at the level that I can now, rather than somebody starting from number 1 and like seeing this slow evolution of me kind of learning how to do it a little better. I just felt like getting a fresh start. And I was quite sick of the title Fuff because it doesn't make any sense and it was stupid, and I never thought I was going to end up stuck with it for 15 years as I did. It was just a random, not very well thought out title, which just fits into a kind of whole, it's just such a stereotypical thing for a comic like that to have a 1-syllable nonsense title. I mean, that goes all the way back to Robert Crumb doing Zap in the late 60s, and actually really it goes back to Mad and Arg, and all these comics that have titles like Oof and Hop and
Plop and Bats.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was like, man, why am I like it just seemed a little stereotypical I was like, I didn't even really think about it, but I'll try something a little different for the next kind of title, I guess.
Well, I screamed my way through one more dead-end day in the tortures of the starving arts. I trashed the 15th song I'd bashed away too long into the dustbin of discarded starts. And my programmer friend invites me out again, but I got nothing all month to be proud of. He said, my friend, it seems art is a sweatshop of dreams, 'cause art's an office that you can't clock out of. But that's nice work if you
I want to hear
get
more
it.
about your for the listeners who haven't had the pleasure of seeing the Jeffrey Lewis Band live. You will occasionally show movies, which are comic performances, frequently to tape recordings. And I was wondering if you could talk about those, and if I've wondered if those were inspired by like Jack Kirby's Chalk Talks or anything like that.
That's fine. I don't even know Jack Kirby did Chalk Talks. I would think of like, I know Windsor McKay would do that like a long time ago as kind of a vaudeville thing. But I don't draw fast enough to do that thing as like a live drawing situation. It started from like you know, in like the late 90s, early 2000s, I was trying to make every appearance that I did a different sort of event. So I wasn't touring yet, and I was just, you know, maybe I would have a gig in New York every 6 weeks or something. So I had plenty of time to think of what can I do at this upcoming gig that I haven't done before. Oh, I'll invite my friend to play banjo with me and my other friend to play trumpet, and we'll work out some arrangements. Or, oh, I'll do, you know, some other, I just, every show was kind of a chance to put on a unique show, which you can't really do in the same way once you start touring, because you're playing every single night and you're just in the car every day. You don't have time to like make a whole book just for that one show and then make a whole new, you know, come up with costumes for the next show. And when you're on tour on the road, my creative input into each gig is coming up with a different set list, and maybe coming up with like, you know, some different songs we can try, new songs, or you know, it's not like I have weeks between each gig. I do make every show different. I have, you know, over 100 songs I can pick from, and I spend some time in the car every day trying to compose some kind of new interesting set list, which I think is a lot of fun and kind of keeps me creatively excited. But in the early days, I was really trying to come up with completely different things I could do at each gig, and the illustrated songs were just one more idea like that. It was just something I did at one gig, maybe in like 99 or something, or 2000. It just seemed such a natural fit, and it seemed to work so well that instead of just doing it at one gig, it was something that kind of stuck with me from my early days of trial and error. It was one of the things that just stuck around, and I just kept making them. So I was like, oh, I'll make a new one of those for my next gig. And, you know, over the years, I just started accumulating them, coming up with more ideas for the kinds of stories that I could tell in that form.
And you were talking a little bit about trying to make each show different and inviting different people. Let's talk about, you've got a grand swath of collaborators that you have worked with down through the years. And I'm wondering how you approach collaborative songwriting, because I know you have full album collaborations with Kimya Dawson and Diane Cluck. And I was wondering how you approach that as opposed to your solo recordings.
Well, you know, even just starting out, it was always me and my brother Jack. You know, I would write songs, and Jack, who was very young at that time, maybe he was like 16, and I was like 21 when we both started making up songs. Some of the songs, like on my first tapes, were songs that Jack would make up, and I would come up with guitar parts or maybe a couple of lines here and there. So there was always like a little bit of collaboration going on just with my brother. And then it was really the additional levels of collaborating with other songwriters that I started meeting at open mic nights. I had a band with some friends called Guitar Situations, where it was kind of just how can like 4 or 5 of us sit around and make up a song together where we all come up with different things to do? And none of us were like good musicians. It was just kind of like a fun way to come up with different ways to make up a song. So that was around 2000 when we had this Guitar Situations band, where our rule was that every show had to have all new songs and anybody could be a part of the band. So from show to show, it was like different people would get together and make up songs together. And we tried to have a rule that every show had all new songs that were all made up collaboratively by the people that happened to be in the band. So it was kind of like the band was a process more than a specific combination of people. Like I wasn't in every Guitar Situations performance. It was really fun for me to go see those shows and see like, oh, what will so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so make up together as Guitar Situations. So it was kind of like a funny experiment and collaboration.
Well, that's neat. But I know that the Guitar Situations did record an album in 2002. And I was wondering if we could play a clip from that and which song you're most partial to from that release.
Yeah, I think Annotations on that album is a pretty good example of what that kind of collaborative mashup sounds like. Different people all contributing parts and overlapping them.
Great. All right. So we'll play a clip of Annotation.
A tiny envelope with your name on it. The chapter makes you think that you are a hit. I'm a hit. Fractals sing a song, the chocolate sings along. On a cake for flap. Fractals sing a song. Jump into the icing, time is on the table. Feeling never felt so wrong, feeling to be able. Jessica, someone I don't know. You could take your rats out to a show. The pan line is a lot longer now, it seems to produce.
So that kind of stuck with me, and the different ways that you could sit down with somebody and come up with your own contributions to making a collaborative song. But it really kicked off for me when I was living in Austin, Texas in the year 2000 and early 2001. Kimya Dawson from the Moldy Peaches came down and stayed with me for a couple of weeks because we had met each other at the Sidewalk Cafe open mic in like 1999. And she was always into traveling by Greyhound bus, and I was living in Austin, so she took a Greyhound bus down from New York. And in the couple of weeks that we were hanging out together in Austin, and she was staying in my little room, she suggested that we make up songs together. And that was really eye-opening for me, like the kinds of ways that she had to make up collaborative songs, which were obviously similar to the ways that she and Adam Green had been making up songs in the Moldy Peaches, where they would trade verses back and forth, and somebody would write one line and the next person would write the next line, or one person would write a couplet, the next person would write a couplet, or they would both write separate rhymes and then mix them on top of each other. And they were kind of like games. It was sort of like, okay, we're sitting around, we have no money, it's raining out or whatever. Like, let's make up instead of playing Scrabble, let's make up a song.
Uh-huh.
So making up those songs with Kimya was really fun and eye-opening, and the results were just, delightful and interesting, and not something that either person could make up on their own. Something for everyone.
Don't forget about your friends.
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 Something for everyone.
To
A
see you,
gallon, a
everybody said,
telephone,
for
a
me to
violin,
say
a
hello to
pine
you
cone,
for
a
that.
hat, a comic book, a letter home, a t-shirt, a water gun, funny stuff and photographs, a hat. Something for everyone, a barbecue, some time alone, a good song, a record deal, a hat. Stuff I saw while I was there, stuff I ate while I was there, a feeling of self-worth.
In addition to your long list of collaborators, you also come from a musical family. I know your uncle is Professor Louie, the rapper, and And I was wondering if having a rapper in the family influenced your songwriting at all.
He's a very big influence and inspiration for me, and he's really the only, my mom plays a little bit of folk guitar, and my dad plays some very good finger-picked country blues. So there was always a guitar in my house growing up, but it certainly wasn't like, my parents don't write songs, and they're not artists. So my uncle Victor, who performs as Professor Louie, he's really like the creative, poetic element that I can turn to as an I can sort of, and I think he's so fantastic at what he does. He's on such a high level, and he's been doing he started out in the 60s doing kind of radical theater stuff, and then he kind of created this rap persona more in like late 70s, early 80s as Professor Louie. He's the kind of guy that, if I write something new, or if he comes to one of my gigs, that's whose opinion matters the most to me, because he really understands what you can do by putting the right words in the right order, and by having something real that you're trying to convey. It's kind of like his standard of artistic practice is what I try to hold myself to.
Way back in the day, 1973, right on out there for you and me and everyone to see. The United States went off the gold standard. Unwind your mind, you can understand it. No box, no locks, don't drop your socks. There's no more gold down in Fort Knox, and we will see the bill sooner or later. What you got in your pocket.
So having someone be an inspiration like that, who's from maybe an older generation, leads me to Peter Stanfill, of the Holy Modal Rounders and the Fugs, and I was hoping you could tell us a little story about how you discovered them and how your collaborations with Peter came about.
Well, I was a fan of the Holy Modal Rounders. I had picked up some of those records over the years, and in addition to being a very big fan of the Fugs, and these were all it's kind of neighborhood history for me, because it's all like Lower East Side Manhattan stuff from the 60s, which I was very curious about, like what was going on in the neighborhood when my parents were first living here in the late 50s and through the 60s. And it's just like a whole musical culture of this part of New York that isn't on the radio, and it's not really represented in a lot of people's ideas of what the 60s were about. But it was a very rich and interesting and weird music scene that was happening in downtown Manhattan in the 60s. And, of course, the Velvet Underground is the most well-known of those bands, but there were a bunch of others, and the Holy Modal Rounders were one of the neighborhood bands. So I had written this piece called The Development of Punk on the Lower East Side of New York from 1950 to 1975, where I sort of tell this poem about how one album kind of led to another, and it was all kind of taking place in the same area and part of the same cultural transitions. So I performed this piece that I had written around 2004 about the development of this this neighborhood music.
The old folks. Then one strange folk band downtown called the Holy Modal Rounders began to make it more anarchistic with weird voices and drug jokes. Mom's out there switching in the kitchen, and Dad's in the living room fussing and bitching. I'm out here kicking the gong for euphoria, euphoria. When your mind starts reeling and walking, inside voices start squealing and squawking, floating around on a belladonna cloud singing you.
And Peter Stanfill happened to be in the audience when I did that performance, so he came up to me afterwards. And so we started talking, and I found out that he's really into comic books also. So we just had a lot to talk about. And of course, I was just a big fan. So it was very exciting for me to get to meet him in person. And so, yeah, I asked him if he would play some music on the album that I was recording at that time, the album City and Eastern Songs. So I had him come and play some fiddle and some banjo on some of my tracks then, which was like 2005. And then we just, I asked him if he'd want to play a show with me at Sidewalk sometime. so we started doing little gigs together, and that just eventually led to, some tours that we did together, and we started writing songs together, and we released some albums together. So yeah, that was just a very exciting and cool thing for me to actually get to know Peter and get to work with him. And he's just, a very inspiring and amazing creative character.
Yeah, I'd like to specifically draw attention to the song "Hey Hey" from "Hey Hey." It's the Jeffrey Lewis and Peter Stanfill band, and I was hoping we could play a brief clip from that. But also, it sounds like Peter is having a lot of fun.
Well, he's just like a guru of how to be a human being and just enjoy this little time that we have to be alive. I mean, he has fun. He gravitates towards things that bring him joy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
Maybe at the next crosswalk, we will not walk, instead we'll all start skipping and jumping. And maybe in this whole New York, a little act of happiness can still mean something. Hey, hey, go ahead, throw away what went before. Music in my head, there's no reason to be bored. Hey, hey, break the string, shake the leg and spread your wings. Hey, hey, many things, everything and anything. Sometimes we're lost.
On the subject of the Rounders and the Fugs, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Thule Kupferberg and the annual Thule festivals, which there's not a lot of information about those online?
Well, this is all just there's not really much information about anything that would go on in this little local, it's like the equivalent of Le Voyeur in Olympia. The Sidewalk Cafe, which closed last year, was just a little place where you could, like Le Voyeur, almost anybody could book a gig there. And it was just a small place and all ages. And so if I felt like doing something like, hey, on Thule Kupferberg's birthday, let me just put together an event where everybody does covers of Thule Kupferberg songs, and I'll put together a band and we'll play our renditions of Thule songs. There's no barrier to do it. They just say like, okay, sure. It doesn't matter if there's an audience for it or not. You can just use the space however you want to use it. So that was something after Thule died in 2010, and I had known him for a few years prior to that. Similar to Peter, I had met him and had started collaborating with him. He was still in the neighborhood. I mean, that's the thing in New York City, the space is so condensed, like everybody's just right here. You would just see Lou Reed walk down the street. Oh, there's David Byrne. Oh, there's Patti Smith. There's Martin Rev from Suicide. I still see, I just saw him in my grocery store the other day. The kind of equalizing level of New York City, like everybody's just walking around and everybody's like right here. So, Thule Kupferberg and Peter Stanfill were just two people that I was fans of who were they lived not that far away from me. And you see them at an art gallery, you see them at a gig, and they're very approachable. They're not like behind glass or behind a velvet rope. If you're a fan and you just want to talk to them, they were right there. So Thule was always very open like that. And then he was interested in some of the stuff I was doing, my history of communism pieces and my I had a lot of stuff that was like neighborhood history and political history that were things that he was interested in. So we had a lot to talk about in that regard. And then after he died, I just started doing these kind of tribute events on his birthday every year. And then we recorded this album, Works by Thule Kupferberg, where I kind of recorded in a studio what I thought were the best renditions of my band covering his songs, some of which were very obscure, some of which were only poems that had never been set to music before. But I really think that that's a fantastic collection of work that a lot of people might not, his stuff in the Fugs is somewhat well known, but he had a lot of other projects that he worked on too.
Right.
This train is bound for Brooklyn. This train
So you were saying that he was interested in some of your history pieces. I see that history is a passion of yours. You've got your history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is part of a project from the History Channel, and your more recent history of Chile. Could you talk a little bit about that and your interest in history? And
Well, this was partially connected to what I was saying earlier about the illustrated songs.
Mhm.
And when I would like write a song and then do illustrations to go with it as an interesting thing that I could do in my gigs. I've been doing that for a few years when I realized that it could be an interesting way to tackle historical topics as well as just my own songs and weird fantasy songs. And a topic that was tremendously interesting to me was the history of communism, because I'd always grown up in a very communist-leaning household, and my grandparents and basically all my family in all directions were very connected to an earlier generation of left-wing politics, where I grew up in a very confused state of mind, because as a kid in the 80s, the communists were always the bad guys in all the movies and everything else. And I never understood why like that was such a distinct clash with the kind of the books that were on the shelves. You know, all my family, my uncle, my parents, my grandparents, all had, we were just steeped in this culture and this literature in which, the capitalists are the bad guys. And so I couldn't understand as a kid, and then as an adult as well, this really huge difference in the way that those histories are perceived. This stuff is just not on TV. It wasn't like the stories of what actually happened are just kind of absent from American culture. It's almost like taboo, like the way they talk about Castro now, or like, did you know that like Obama like once was at an event that Fidel Castro was at? It's like what? Well, so what? Like what? Who is Fidel Castro? What did he do? Like, who is this Che Guevara guy? Who's Ho Chi Minh? Like, what the hell was the Vietnam War about? Like, how come I grew up with all these movies, Full Metal Jacket and Platoon and, Hamburger Hill and Apocalypse Now, with 10 million movies about Vietnam when I was a kid and in the 90s, and none of them ever said what it was about. Like, none of them even mentioned, do they even mention Ho Chi Minh? Do they mention the French colonization? There's no information at all. It's just like, oh, the Vietnam War was a big thing. There were anti-war protests. There were, but what, like, it's just blank. It's just absent. And so that really gravitated, I really gravitated towards learning about this huge part of 20th century history that was a complete mystery to me. And then it was sort of like I was presenting my findings to my audience. I would learn all this stuff about the history of Vietnam, and my mind would be blown when I was like, oh my God, that's what was going on? I can't wait to show my audience this story, because it might blow their minds the way my mind was blown. Like, now I understand Apocalypse Now. Now I understand what the Tonkin Gulf incident was and how it relates to what happened in the Korean War and blah, 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 blah. It's just like, it's like a look behind it's like the other side of the 20th century that is like in American history and culture. It's like, it's just erased in this very weird way.
Right. Yeah. When I was in high school, we never learned about the Korean War. Like, it never came up at all.
Oh yeah, never. The Korean War. What, like, never mentioned.
Yeah. Do you get a lot of people coming up to you after shows, saying that I never knew this. This was totally new information to me. Thank you for the history.
Oh yeah, totally. But the scariest thing is when the opposite happens, when somebody comes up and is like, well, actually, I'm a professor of French history, and my like biggest fear is when somebody knows what I'm talking about, because I'm just like a layman like anybody else. Like, I'm just up there. I'm basically just telling people like what it took me, say, 3 months of research to learn. It's not like I'm a taking a graduate program in the history of Chile.
A land once ruled by Inca that was colonized by Spain. The colony claimed independence in 1818, but they let the inequalities of conquest still remain. By the early 1900s, Chile mined its copper ore, and the U.S. businessmen that owned the mines were billionaires. And while a few wealthy Chileans owned all land, the rest were poor. But democracy brought votes, and voting everybody shares. By the 50s, votes brought socialists like Salvador Allende, who asked why Chile's mines should be for U.S. businessmen. And he said, we don't want violence, may our voting change things gently.
So I'm not learning anything that somebody else couldn't easily learn with, 3 or 4 or 5 months of looking into it. But that's partially why it's so astonishing that nobody knows this stuff.
Right.
It's all right there once you start looking, and these are not conspiracy theories. This is just what happened.
Right. And how did you get hooked up with the History Channel then?
Well, they were looking. There was a guy, Shane, who was looking for material. He had been hired to create content or find people who could create content for the history people. And, what I do is essentially perfect for exactly what they needed. It's engaging, it's entertaining, it's short form, it's colorful. And it's very low budget because it's just me with a big pad of paper and some crayons and a guitar. So yeah, they had a whole bunch of topics. They gave me like a huge list of topics that they were like, we don't have enough about this stuff in our archives. Like we've covered a lot of, they've done a lot about World War II, but they don't have very much about whatever, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or, they had a whole list of stuff that they were trying to increase their content on. So I picked 5 of them that appealed the most to me, and I did those projects. And then the next year they approached me again to do another 5. So we did 10 in total. Well, the Chile one was really a big deal to me. That story affects me very deeply emotionally. It raises so many very troubling questions. It's also a little more contemporary than the early ones because this is stuff that happened in the 70s. It's not, the Korean War is like in the 50s. The Vietnam War is in the 60s, and it has its roots earlier than that. And so the story of Chile is a little more contemporary and related to events that are still unfolding now. I've put a lot of pressure on myself. I was like, how am I possibly going to tackle this? And now that I finally got it done and posted it, I don't know if it's as good at, I think maybe my story of Cuba or my story of Vietnam are maybe a little better in terms of the telling. I'm not sure if my Chile song came out as good, in my own opinion, as some of the ones that I think are my best pieces. It's not the overall masterpiece that I was hoping it would be. But that's the way it is. I write a lot, like I was saying before, I write and record a lot of songs, and not all of them are my, only a few of them are the ones that I consider are the strongest. And it's the same drawing in a sketchbook. You're just drawing, and once in a while you really latch onto something and something really works for you in a certain way. And that doesn't necessarily relate to how anybody else takes it, which is part of why it's kind of cool for me to put out these home recorded songs, because they're not what I feel makes sense for me to play live or to include on an official album. That's not necessarily going to be somebody else's opinion of them. Right. So it's a weird thing. And when you're making stuff, you don't really know.
Right.
America must act, and we must act here right away. This virus puts our national resources under threat today. Can't let our crowning jewels expire from neglect or from delay. Our Federal Reserve must be preserved to sing and play. The first thing we must ask for as this task force mission started is an enormous thick partition that quickly cordons Dolly Parton. Work 9 to 5 to build it, seal from Jackson out to Raleigh. I bet Jolene don't take her man, and COVID-19 don't take Dolly. America must act, and we must act here right away.
hanging in my kitchen since we played together in my house, which is always a great conversation starter, is your David Berman poster. And
I wonder does that start conversations? Do people have any idea what they're looking at when they see that?
yeah, well, a lot of times people will come in and I'll find them looking at it, and they'll be like, pointing out whichever songs that they have found, and then I'll show which ones that I have found, and then our roommates will come in and be like, "Oh yeah, no, this is my favorite David Berman song. It's in this corner." So it does spark conversation.
Oh, that's great. So people aren't just like, oh, what is this colorful, because a lot of people look at that, they're like, what is this? Where's Waldo? Because people don't, I have those when I play a gig, I might have those posters. I have one for the fall, 100 fall songs. And the majority of people that are at a Jeffrey Lewis gig are not necessarily going and thinking like maybe they don't know the fall, maybe they don't know the Silver Jews. So they just think, here's this colorful, detailed image that is on Jeffrey's merch table. Let me just buy that because it's nice to look at.
So how did you become acquainted with David Berman, and how did that poster come about? I guess for those listeners who haven't seen what Jeffrey has created, it's a poster that has different graphic representations of different Silver Jews songs.
Well, in 2015, I'm a big fan of the band The Fall, and The Fall have like dozens of albums and hundreds of great songs. Well, great if you're a Fall fan.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this idea around 2015, like, wouldn't it be really fun if I did a poster where I tried to cram in as many Fall songs as possible? So this was something that I had done back in the early mid 90s in like Grateful Dead parking lots and stuff like that. And then I hadn't done one of those drawings in many, many years. And then around 2015, I was like, man, it would be fun if I did something like that for the fall. I just could picture it looking so cool. There's like hundreds of fall songs, and they all have such colorful titles, like a Rebellious Jukebox and Spectre versus Rector, and the Fall's the Man Whose Head Expanded. I could just see 100 different fall songs that would be very cool in the to be illustrated in a complicated crowd drawing. So I did that, and I guess David Berman had seen that somewhere, and he contacted me out of the blue and asked me if I would not necessarily do the same thing for his own songs, but he said he really liked complicated artwork like that. And he had this new album, Purple Mountains, that was going to be coming out soon. And he wanted to know if I would draw something that was like very detailed and complicated that could go with the album in some way. So we talked about some different ideas. And then it just kind of seemed like the idea that we both liked the most was this idea of doing something basically the same as I had done for the fall, just doing this poster that would have as many of his songs in it as I could create. So I spent some weeks working on it, and I was emailing him back, and I never met him in person. We were just email corresponding, and I would just send him a photograph of the artwork as it was coming. As I would draw a bit more of it, I'd photograph it and send it to him. And it was just so much fun for both of us. I think we were both going through a dark winter, and this project was just making us both, really happy, and like seeing these updates. And I was just having a great time every day, just sitting at my desk working on this thing. And of course, I was really looking forward to meeting him. My band was supposed to play a few shows opening up for Purple Mountains on the tour. And of course, he killed himself just a week before the tour started. So I would have met him that week, but reality just took this completely different turn. And that poster, rather than maybe being the start of him being somebody that I might have gotten to know, the same way that I got to know Peter Stamfel, or I got to know Tuli Kuferberg just from some kind of random interaction originally. It could have been really interesting to have somebody like David Berman who, maybe, but the thing is, he is very well known, and, he was like on a very high level. Many, many people are fans of David Berman and the Silver Jews. So it's not like, I mean, it's not like I had the idea that I was suddenly going to be this guy's best friend. But it was just very fascinating to have this email interaction with him, because he's a real songwriter, as a lyricist, as a poet, as somebody who works very deeply with putting words together. That interests me tremendously, just to know how somebody like that thinks and how they work. And I love, I have all of his albums anyway, even, before that. And so that was just very, of course, at first, very gratifying to have contact with him at all and be able to do this project. And then very tragic to have him suddenly vanish from everybody's life in that really horrible way that none of us will ever get over, because it's just so unbelievable that it happened like that. So what I'm left with is this poster that I kind of have to remember him by, and that everybody has now to, just to celebrate how cool all of his songs were. And it's nice because it's like a fun, there's nothing dark about that poster.
Right.
You were conscious and responsive and present. You weren't trying to make something unpleasant. You were just bouncing off of things that were trashy, and it was never very tricky or flashy. You had a vision that was clear and directed, and the ways it worked were all unexpected. You were unbelievable and you were undaunted, and you were exactly just what nobody wanted.
So you've got some new things coming up on the horizon. I've heard that there's possible release of new recordings with Peter Stamfel.
Yeah, I've got 2 albums worth of recordings I did with Peter that we've worked on in probably like 2017, 2018. That could be released as a double album, which I think could be kind of a fun way to do it, since I don't think either of us have ever released a double album before, and it is 2 albums worth of material. I kind of like that as like I think that these Stamfel recordings make sense to me as some kind of epic double album.
And lastly, we've got your Watchmen analysis book is finally seeming like it's going to come out there.
Oh yeah, well that's been taking me I've been working on that for like over 20 years, which is just embarrassing and ridiculous. And every time there's some delay and I put it aside for another year, then it's like, am I going to have to then I have to rewrite the whole introduction, because I'm like, the current state of the comic industry and how it relates to, how different comics are today from how they were in 1986 when Watchmen came out. And what, it's constantly out of date. Every time it's like ready to be published and then it doesn't get published, it just opens the door to me not feeling like it's done. I feel like my analysis is the most interesting and in-depth one that has yet to, nobody has ever, I think, written something like this. But I don't know if it's not gonna, I don't see it being received with, I have no idea how it would be received. I just want to get it done and out, because I've been working on it too long and it's just been hanging over my head as an unfinished project.
Right. Yeah, well, I'm sure that there will be some kind of relief to just have it done, regardless of what happens.
I'm so ready for it to just be something that I put behind me. I put so much work into it, and it's ridiculous that it doesn't exist yet in the world, really.
I think we have gotten a lot of great stuff. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and coming on the show for my very first podcast ever.
Well, you're off to a good start, as long as this got recorded.
Yeah, well, I just double checked and it looks like it did. And I guess my last question is, and forgive me if this is a little bit too cute of a question, but I have, in your song Time Trades, you talk about the importance of finding joy and developing your skills. Do you find that over time you find new interests to develop, or that you're honing in more on what you've done for years?
I think you got to stick to something. Like, if I started saying, well, I'm tired of drawing, I'm going to start playing the trumpet, and like, oh, well, I'm tired of the trumpet, I'm going to, take up gymnastics. you can't really get, it's like being in love with somebody. You can't get to the deeper levels without spending time with one thing or one person. The idea that, you don't know what it's like to draw comics for 20 years when you've only been drawing comics for 10 years. And then when you've been drawing comics for 20 years, you don't know what your relationship is going to be to that skill, when you've been doing it for 40 years. And if all you ever do is know what your relationship is to a certain skill for a short period of time, that's a different kind of thing. There's levels of depth and understanding, no matter what it is. It could be, so I was starting to say it could be poetry or something. I'm like, wait, that's like a line in the song. It could be anything. I mean, why do I even say anything? My songs, when I write a song, I'm like putting my thoughts in a more coherent order, obviously. I'm like putting the words in a certain order to hone in on what I'm trying to say. And then when I'm just talking in person, it's the same thought because I'm the same me. It's just not as well, it's not put together in the right way. So the song basically says it better than I can say it.
There's a way that time can offer you a trade. You gotta do something that you can get smarter at. You gotta do something you might just be a starter at. You'd better do something that you can get better at. 'Cause time is gonna take so much away. But that's the way that time can offer you a trade. And maybe that's why they call a trade.
We just heard Jack Habiger's interview with Jeffrey Lewis. Jack, thanks so much for doing that. I love it.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Jeffrey for making the time to talk. And I'm super excited to hear the rest of this season.
If you like this episode and want to hear more like it or learn more about it, there's a website that has additional information on all the featured guests for every episode. That is lowprofilepodcast.com. And then you've also got the band Pigtails on Bandcamp.
Right, yes. And if you're interested in the band Pigtails, then that's thebandpigtails.bandcamp.com also to hear our self-titled record, Pigtails.
And of course, you can find Jeffrey Lewis's materials, comics, music, and otherwise at thejeffreylewissite.com. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you.
Nowadays, that stuff is so expensive, I don't bother to try. Everything's reissued, and plus everything is priced really high. The field is overcrowded, it's impossible to get a good fix. So I walk right past the records, and I flip through all the used compact discs. Yeah, nowadays it's mostly CDs. No one wants to keep them, so there's plenty. Folk and punk and private press and rap and indie. Bonus tracks and liner notes are just empty. As long as I can still make a good discovery, I've still got that music hunger disease. That disease that I got from LPs. When they were dirt cheap in the